Episode 98 of People I Know Show. Kurt Carstensen joined today by Gary Arndt. Gary, I know that you travel around quite a bit. Where in the world are you talking with me from today?
Right now, I'm in Wisconsin, northeastern
Okay.
Wisconsin, about 30 minutes from Green Bay, Lambeau Field.
All right. Well, that leads me into exactly what I want to talk about right away with you. The title of the show is called People I Know Show, and I tend to have on guests that I know pretty well or have met in person or something. For you and I, that isn't the case, and we've connected in an interesting way lately from my perspective. But as I go through your bio, I'm going to point out a couple of reasons why I think we might get along. I'm from Minnesota. You just said you're from Wisconsin. And one of the things from your bio that really stood out for me is you said that you didn't see salt water or touch salt water until you're 21 years old. I don't
Yeah.
think I did until I was 28. Among a few other things, I'm a super curious guy. It seems like you're way more curious than me. So those are a few things I think we have in common. But here's where we
Well, I
might
lived in
not.
Minnesota up until last year.
Okay,
I,
well, even
I
more
lived in
in common.
Minneapolis, yeah. And the reason I moved is because I lived right off Lake Street. Um, and so when everything kind of went to hell, I just eventually put all my stuff in a U-Haul one day and left.
Wow. Okay, so you were probably towards for the people that understand the area towards Uptown area more.
Yeah, I was like 1 block away from Lindale and Lake.
Okay, so
And
this is another way that we are we're going in slightly different paths in this way. I just moved 1 block from Lake Street, but way on the east side. So you went back to Wisconsin. I'm here in Minneapolis, and as curious as of a guy that I am, I notice you have several degrees and have pursued some other things. I love to travel, but you travel way more than me. So now I want to get your perspective on some of these things until I get to a few of my other thoughts. Gary, of all the things that you've done and been involved with, if you had to label yourself as some type of person, some type of career, what do you call yourself more than anything when you talk about the jobs you've done or the things that interest you?
I have never had a normal job ever. Um, I've the only time period of my life where I had like a 9 to 5 job where I had a paycheck. It wasn't a real 9 to 5 job. I had an internet company that I started in the 90s, and I sold it in 1998, and in Minneapolis. And for a year, I was on their payroll, and there's like nobody above me in the org chart, no one below me in the org chart. So I would literally, and they were paying me really good money as part of the deal, like 6 figures. And I would show up to work at like 10:30, made sure everyone saw me, go to my cubicle, surf the internet for 2 hours, and then I would go to lunch and leave. And that was pretty much my day. And they were paying me an obscene amount of money to not run my company, which I never understood. And yeah, so that's the closest I've ever come. I don't know what I've never even used the term to try to describe what I've done. I've just done a whole bunch of different things. I've always kind of moved on. I had a period of my life where I did one thing and then I sort of reinvented myself and did something else. And it kind of goes in 4 year shifts. Um, the Until you move on to something else, although the traveling lasted a little longer than that.
So is the 4 years about to come to an end? Is there going to be a whole new version of you that's about to emerge?
No, I just started it. Uh, I because of what happened is during so 2016 or 2006, I'm sorry, I hatched this idea to travel around the world. So 2007, sold my house, which was in Eden Prairie, uh, turned over the keys, and basically I thought I would travel around the world for a year or two. That turned into basically a decade. And even after I stopped traveling full time, I still was traveling for, say, half or a third of the year. And when the pandemic hit, everything just ground to a halt. Within a period of a few weeks in March of 2020, 95% of my income all dried up because I was in travel. And I never in a million years thought that the travel industry, which is a really big industry globally, like there are a lot of countries where that is their number one part of their GDP, it just stopped. And um, I had kind of all my eggs in that basket in the travel and tourism industry. And I didn't know what to do. And I began talking to other kind of high level people that worked at travel companies. And I initially thought in March, oh, this is going to be over in like a month, right? Like April of 2020. Yeah. And I was talking to some Chinese group about, because at the time everybody was still focused on like what was happening in China, but doing something, a project to maybe get people interested in tourism. And obviously that was completely wrong. And so I had to think of something to do. So I launched a new podcast in July of last year. And that's pretty much what I've been doing ever since and focusing on that. I wanted to do something that wasn't reliant on travel, but still kind of adjacent to it, that I could use a lot of the things that I've learned over the years. And so I started kind of a history educational show. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And that is how I found you. The podcast is called Everything Everywhere Daily. And I just looked it up. It was about a week and a half into September. I used the Overcast podcast listening platform. And for a long time, they put ads of other podcasts at the bottom, and usually I'd ignore it. And then I started to try to sample a few of them. And most that I sample, I listen to one episode or two episodes and I stop listening to. But yours is the rare one that's daily and that I've listened to every single day. And I've gone back and listened to some other ones. And it's that podcast that's really me as someone that's been podcasting for a few years now. It's made me think, boy, there's other ways to do this, but there's really catchy, great ways to do that the way that you are. It's short, it's wide variety of interests, and it's so well written and well researched. So I'm curious with that, Gary, how much time do you spend on each 10 or 12-minute episode to research it and write it in a way that to me comes across so great?
It's about 5 or 6 hours a day. And I have a very weird schedule. So as we are talking right now, it's about 2:45 in the
Hmm.
afternoon. I woke up about an hour and a half ago,
Okay.
and I'm going to bed now at like 5 or 6 in the morning, to get the show at the door every day. So that'll give you an idea of I spend most of the evening, late, well, early morning actually, just writing the show, and I have a pretty long list. So I'm tomorrow actually I'll be doing show number 500, which sounds like a lot, but for a daily show, it's about a year and a half.
Hmm.
And I have a running list that I keep every time I come up with an idea, and that is getting close to 600 ideas. So it's always kind of evolving and growing. But yeah, it takes a lot of time. But I have some friends with very successful daily podcasts. And when I thought of this idea, and my initial idea was to do a longer Dan Carlin type, show. And then I just sort of did the math, and I realized doing a shorter daily show would be more, from a business standpoint, more successful than doing a longer show, and in some ways easier, because I'm just kind of scratching the surface on a lot of the topics that I talk about. You can't really
Hmm.
give an in-depth history. Many of the topics, people have written entire books about it, or it's been a subject that they studied for a PhD thesis, and I'm doing a 10-minute podcast. So it's not like I can get too in depth into it. Whereas if I was doing a longer show, and this started out, the show was I was going to do an episode on why the Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world, because there's no reason that it should. It's not a famous person. It's not a royal. It's not a religious figure, because many of the paintings at the time were of the Virgin Mary or of saints or something. So why is this picture of this random woman so famous? And there's a really good story behind it. Basically, it was stolen in the early 20th century, and it became a huge cause. And I've done an episode on this, but it was in the news, and people went to the Louvre to see the spot on the wall where it was taken, the empty spot. And then when it was discovered, it was in Italy, and it did this big procession to get back to France. And along the way, it stopped, and tens of thousands of people would see it at every stop. And that's how it became so famous, and why today it's the most famous work of art. And as I was doing research originally, I was getting into the life of Da Vinci and about it and everything. And I was like, oh man, I got enough notes to do a 3 hour show. And I just didn't think it would work. And then when the pandemic and everything hit, I kind of revisited the idea and I did the math. And it's like, yeah, this actually makes more sense as a daily show. And a lot of the things I've discovered that I did not know when I did it, I've had people tell me uh, they listen to the show with their children when they take them to school, and I got a lot of 8 and 9-year-old, 10-year-old fans. Surprising, I never that wasn't the plan, but okay, I'll take it. And because it's so short, like you may have noticed this in your podcast player, there are some podcasts that are pretty long. And if I have a 10-minute podcast and a 2-hour podcast, I will listen to the 10-minute podcast first because it's easy to get out of the way,
Hmm.
right? You can just get it done. It's a lower commitment for people to listen. And I've seen that reflected in a lot of the sats. And like you, once people start to listen, because all the topics are evergreen, I've had many people tell me that they've gone through the entire archive, which is, a lot at this point, listening to pretty much everything.
I love it. And I encourage everyone that's taking in this conversation to check it out. I'll have links in my show notes to make sure that people do. And it is your podcast that led to this conversation. And to me, it was a controversy. Maybe not for many of your listeners, but there is a sound effect that you'd play at the end of every episode. Your writing is terrific, I think. And one of your best written parts of the episode would be your final line. And then you would play this.
That's
So
the
that's the new
new,
one.
yeah.
That's the new one, which I like. And if that was the only one I ever would have heard, I think it would have been just fine. But I'm going to try the old one more time here. And I think you play it louder in the episode where it really it's a punch right after this sharp line that you write. And I love that one. And it is like one of my favorite things about your podcast. And then one day I noticed it was gone and I was kind of bothered by it. And then you talked about it in the episode. And then I messaged you and it led to us having a conversation here today. So me as a loyal fan being upset about something, I guess leads us to talking today, Gary.
It's such a minor thing. It's literally like 2 or 3 seconds of audio. Um, when I got the review that complained about it, and he wasn't the first person that did it, which is the reason. If it was just one person, I probably wouldn't have done anything. But basically, it's a very sharp,
Mhm.
and I think it was that um, suddenness of the sound that would just startled people when they were listening. You hear my voice, and all of a sudden you hear that. Um, so, the point of the sound effects are basically to provide audio transitions to different segments of the show.
Yep.
So I have one after I do my ad that before the body of the show. So you can always tell where that is. And if I ever need to go back and maybe move something in or out, I know where those audio breaks are. And so so long as I had something that I felt was kind of like a finality, I was happy with it. And the newer one just sort of eases people into it. I felt it was a minor change, and I'm sure there were probably other people that felt the same way if I had multiple people comment on it. So I figured just change it.
But one of the great things about it, I think, and maybe this isn't the case, but when you aren't able to do an episode one day, you'll rebroadcast one of them. Will you change that in the rebroadcast, or will you let it exist in the rebroadcast?
No, it's in all the old stuff. I'm not going to waste my time changing a 3 second thing. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe once a week, maybe once every other week, I'll just get really tired and I just need to take a break. And so I have enough old episodes now where I can just run an old one. Um, so that's one of the things I'm doing.
And all the old ones have been new for me, and I'd imagine at some point in the future, even if I've heard one of the old ones, that I'll still appreciate and can give 10 or 12 minutes to listening back to it to try to learn it a little bit better, what it is that you've researched for 5 or 6 hours and present it to your listeners.
Uh, I'm actually thinking of redoing some of the shows because I'm keeping a running list of because there are show updates that always come out. Like I'll talk about a topic and then I'll see an article come out a few weeks later about the same topic. And so one of the I just saw one today. There was a show I did on a woman named Jean Clement, who was supposedly the oldest woman in the world. She lived to be 122, I think, or 121. supposedly. And there was always this big thing that she wasn't really that old. What happened was she took her mother's identity when her mother died to keep getting the pension. And
Mm.
then she ended up living to be like 100 or 101. But because she had stolen her mom's identity, then she had to go along with this and claim, ended up being 121. And now I just saw an article today that, oh, maybe she actually was that old. It's very hard to tell because you're dealing with stuff from the late 19th century and there just wasn't a lot of evidence. But there's been a lot of story updates like that. So I've been thinking for some, because I've already written the script, it's actually pretty easy to just go back and uh, edit the script. The recording is the easiest thing I do. It's the writing and the research that takes all the time. So
Hmm.
maybe doing that, or maybe doing some of these updates for just people on Patreon or something.
So it seems like if you wanted to call yourself a podcaster now, above all the other titles, you could. Is it going after a year and a half, going well enough in a way that you think it could sustain you fully for a long time, or even, in fact, like become one of the top podcasts? I don't know where it ranks and how it's growing, but what are the trends for listenership?
It's going well. I'm doing a little under 150,000 downloads a month.
Wow.
So it's about 5,000 a day.
Okay.
Uh, and as you said, you found me through an ad on Overcast, so I'm actually buying advertising. And when you do the math, uh, as I sat down and I actually calculated, okay, so if I have this many, blah, 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 you can calculate the value of a subscriber to a podcast. And I figured the value for mine, give or take, is about $14 just through ad, $14 per year per subscriber. And
Okay.
a lot of that has to do with the fact that I have a daily show. So I'm going to be running on average more ads than, say, a weekly show. Uh, and the cost of subscriber acquisition is much less than $14. And I was kind of just, I started doing this. I'm like, why isn't everyone doing this? I don't get it. This is basically printing money. This is a huge arbitrage opportunity. And then when I looked at, because one of the things that's never ever talked about in podcasting circles, you'll have all these podcasting gurus that talk about how to grow your show, and the reason they're talking about it is because they have not grown a show. Because the people that have grown successful shows don't talk about this stuff because they're too busy making money off their show. And if you look at what the networks and the big shows do, they do a lot of paid promotion. Jordan Harbinger is spending $500,000 a year promoting his podcast because it works. And you hear people, their advice, the gurus say, oh, well, use social media. And all these people with six-figure audiences, when I have heard them do interviews or have been able to talk to them, they all say, yeah, we found that it just doesn't work. If it works, it doesn't scale that much. And the podcasting gurus have no data. It's just conventional wisdom. Oh, well, social media is just what you do. I'm not saying you can do social media if you want. And I should say, I have very large followings on like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Um, but the place where I've seen the biggest bang for my buck in terms of promoting my podcast has been on TikTok, where I didn't even have an account. Because things can go viral on TikTok. They can't on Instagram. You can't share something that easily. Whereas on TikTok, you can. So yeah, I've had, you'll post something, you maybe just get a few hundred likes, and then all of a sudden you get one video you post, which is 50,000. And all I do is I take the cold intro for my show, which is like 30 seconds, put it on a static image, and upload it. I use Headliner on TikTok, and that's all I've done. And I just hit 5,000 followers on TikTok today. That's all I do. I don't do any other sort of promotion on TikTok. I just use it as part of my workflow now.
Well, this is giving me some ideas for my podcast. I have one of the things that I enjoy most about it is to connect with people from my life and people from my past, and occasionally someone new. One of the things I like the least about it is trying to promote it. So you're giving me some good ideas, and I think ideas for other people with podcasts or whatever it is they're trying to get out into the world, that maybe the conventional wisdom isn't actually the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I think you just need to do the math and look at, if you have X number of ads at X CPM and you do this many episodes, this is what your revenue per show will be. And then you just need to figure out, okay, well, you can basically put it down to a listener. How many shows will you produce in a year? And then what is so basically, if one person, if you price an ad per thousand, and one person is 1/1000th of that, what will they contribute for the amount in a year? And if you work it that way, then it makes a lot of sense.
It does make sense. And you have a few degrees. One of them is a math degree. So this comes in handy for something like this, I'd imagine.
Yeah, it's not like I'm solving differential equations every day, but it's helpful as a way of thinking, um, and problem solving. Um, and I think that's a lot of people, they poo poo math, like, oh, I'll never need that. And there's a lot of things that you learn that maybe you're never going to use directly, but it's a way of thinking that helps you, get through life, or helps you succeed in other areas. And I'm a big, if you, given the nature of my show, I'm a big believer in lifelong learning. And too many people, I think, believe, oh, well, you go to school or maybe you go to university and that's when you learn and then you're done. It's like, no, you're not. I don't particularly think our schools do a very good job. One of the things that I've come up with doing my podcast was this idea of, okay, what should a relatively informed, intelligent person know? What are the things that they should know? And not as if you don't know them, you failed or you didn't do a good job, but okay, here are the things that you should set about knowing how to do, or learning about these facts. And there's a lot of facts through history that people just aren't aware of. Um, even people who say, "Oh, I was never good at math," I always encourage them, well, go back and learn it now. Go to Khan Academy. It's free, and just watch some videos. And if you don't have the pressure of getting a grade or having to do problem solving, and you just approach it as like a philosophical problem, to understand this stuff better, you can actually get through all the algebra through calculus pretty easy if you just are just focusing on understanding what it is.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the things in your bio, you wrote that you were about to go get a higher degree, and then as you're about to start that, you realized that was just what way too much work, time, and effort, and you totally changed paths. And this is a perfect example in today's age. If you want to, especially if you're already doing okay in your life, you can learn anything you want and try to apply that in some other way, as opposed to feeling the need to get a higher degree because it sure can help. Sometimes it doesn't help as much as you'd like, but either way, the time and effort spent into that one degree can go in a lot of different directions and passions and interests, and save you a lot of money, perhaps in the meantime.
I've always asked the question: if you were given two options, one, um, you can get a degree from Harvard, but you won't learn anything, but you will get the degree and all the credentials that go with it. Option two, you can get the knowledge, but and you won't pay any money, but you won't get the degree from Harvard. Which would people choose? And people would almost always take the degree without the knowledge, because the other option, it's not a hypothetical scenario. You can do that now. Literally, MIT puts all their courses online. You can watch all the lectures and it's all there. So, and there's nothing secret they teach you at Harvard or these places. You're not going to learn a special handshake, and there's not a special form of math that, they put it on black hoods and they teach you. It's the same stuff taught everywhere using the same materials, and you can learn that anywhere you go. And so much of what our educational system has become is really more credentialing than learning. And that is I believe in the next 10 years, 20 years, you're going to see a huge shakeout in the world of education, because I don't think that what they're doing is sustainable, because it's becoming more and more expensive, and it's just not worth it anymore for people. They're pricing themselves out, and what you're getting for the money you put in isn't necessarily worth it.
I totally agree, and I think more and more in today's age, all of this is available to learn. As you mentioned, MIT and many other universities, you can learn whatever they're offering, but you need to be able to prioritize putting forever learning into your daily routine as a and fighting off the Instagrams and the TikToks and the Netflixes of the world, which you can enjoy to an extent. But I really think those things can suck people right into a point where the extra time in their day isn't going towards learning. And I've been this before. Sometimes I still am now. You really got to have an intention to learn and not just enjoy your time.
It's intellectual junk food is what it is. And so much of what's presented to us, whether it's on television and it's reality TV, um, why do people know who Kim Kardashian is? What has she done? Is she a great actress? No. Is she a great singer? No. Why is she famous? Why? Why do hundreds of millions of people follow her on Instagram? There's no reason. And well, the reason is she did a porn tape once, but um and she has done, and I will say her family has done a masterful job of building a business, and it really is a business of keeping themselves perpetually in the news,
Mhm.
in tabloids, and that's all by design. Um, because I literally know people who have worked for tabloid papers, and they've told me, behind the scenes, some of the stuff that they've heard and how it all works, and it really is it's not, there's nothing real about reality TV or any of this stuff. And you're far better off focusing on reading a book where you can learn something than wasting your time on celebrity gossip or Instagram influencers.
And it's a thing that it took me a few years to kind of step away from. I don't know that I was like but the one time I caught myself accidentally watching the Kardashian show, I got sick of it really fast and turned it off. But there is so much out there of the sort that can be enjoyed if you want to, but I don't know how much that entertainment really gets us. So I'm not to preach like I'm doing everything right with my time, but it's really challenging to avoid all of these distractions that really won't gain us more than a few hours of I don't know, not thinking or just feeling whatever it is that you want to feel.
Yeah, and
But
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with, watching a film or reading a novel or things like that, because those are legitimate forms of art. Um, but the Kardashians are not a legitimate form of art. I don't know why people are watching this. And there's so many shows and other people, and a lot of these Instagram influencers are aping this sort of behavior because it clearly does work. It's simply selfies of them in some exotic place. And it doesn't matter where it is. It just can be a random beach somewhere, or in front of a car, or in front of a limousine, to show off their faux wealth. And that's all it is. And because people don't care about what goes behind it. I've traveled the world very extensively, and I think during the entire time I don't even have 10 pictures of myself that I've taken. And I've never understood the desire. I go to places and I see people and they take a selfie, in front of the Grand Canyon or something, and then immediately leave. That their only purpose was to take a picture of themselves, as if all their friends would think that they were a liar for having said that they were there and they needed some sort of proof.
I will admit that I took a selfie in front of the Grand Canyon, Gary, but I did also enjoy and appreciate it, and recognize that the next time I go back, I want to put more time into it so I can go hike the Grand
And again,
Canyon.
I'm not against the concept of taking a picture of yourself. People have done this for a long time, or you give a camera to someone. That's fine. Um, but it's become an obsession to the point where there's a large group of people where that's the only thing that matters, right? That if you look at their phone, it's only selfies. They never took a picture of just the Grand Canyon or anything else. That was, they didn't even care that they were there. It was just a backdrop for something to put on Instagram.
The best example I've seen of this is sometime during, uh, I suppose, some of the riots last year. I don't know if it was in Minnesota or somewhere else, but there was one of these Instagram models or wannabe Instagram models who came up on someone that was doing actual work to repair something, asked to like help out for a minute, took one photo and then left, but someone else captured this. And it was a perfect example of seeing that this probably happens constantly with almost every photo that you see on Instagram if you're following the type of people that are posting those things as you're
I've
describing.
I've seen it all over the world. Especially in the last few years, where it's become a thing, where I've caught these Instagram models and whatnot doing the same sort of stuff, where they try to take some great pose. I was in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, and this trip I was on, there was a woman who was an Instagram influencer from China, and we hiked up a mountain this one day in a national park, and everyone has hiking gear, stuff you'd wear to hike on a mountain. She had an evening gown, and just so she could take pictures at the top of the mountain with her in the evening gown.
High heels too, I'd hope, to really
I
put the outfit
think she
together.
had them in a bag, and she had some other shoes that she otherwise wore.
Oh, that's funny. Gary, I have to mention that when I did first message you, I was in the Bahamas at that time. It was my first trip to the Bahamas in my 22nd country. But what I thought was so fascinating about that, when I was there, I wanted to do some research on the Bahamas. So I Googled something about the Bahamas. And without even realizing it, I clicked on one
My
of the
website came up.
yes, your blog entry about the Bahamas came up, and then I realized is totally independent of our other conversation that had happened, and I thought that was
That
a
money, that article made me so much money when a hurricane hit, because everybody was doing research about the Bahamas. Um, the Bahamas are a very interesting country. They are the closest country to the United States after Russia. A lot of people don't think of Russia as being that close, but it actually is in Alaska.
no.
I think from Bimini to Florida, it's about 30 miles, roughly. And if you look at where the sea meets, it's maybe even less than that. I don't know if you ever took a look at the Bahamas currency, but I think it's their $1 bill. The image on it is of the Nassau Police Band.
So I was there with my sister and my niece and nephew. My nephew had gotten a one Bahamian dollar currency, and I read that on your article. Then I asked him what's on the dollar, and it was some person. They had changed it, or maybe he had a different version of it. But apparently, that's not the only one out there. But I do believe you that that was what they
The
used at one
other
time.
weird thing that you may have noticed is most of the cars that they import are from the United States. And our cars, we drive on the right, but the driver's side is on the left hand side of the car. Well, they drive on the left because they're a former British colony, but they have American cars. So most of the drivers are actually positioned near the shoulder of the road, not the
Mhm.
median. And it's one of the few the U.S. Virgin Islands is like this as well.
I've seen that in Jamaica as well, I think, but yeah, not very often. And it's a mix. Some are one way or some are the other way, and it seems like not the ideal way to drive.
In the Pacific, there are some islands that are just the opposite. Where, like in Micronesia, they were an American territory at one time, and so they drive on the right, but they import a lot of their cars from Japan, which they drive on the left, so they have right-hand drive vehicles.
Mhm.
So it's just the mirror image of what you'll see in places in the Caribbean, like the Bahamas.
One of the other things in the Bahamas, my experience there wasn't my typical travel experience. That was like a resort hangout vacation because I tagged along with my sister and her two young adult children who had never flown out of the country before. And I recognize they were hesitant to go explore the Bahamas, and I would have been okay. And I'm not. I think when an American leaves the United States for the first time, there's hesitancy about danger, and I think there was some things you could read online that made Bahamas seem dangerous.
No.
So I didn't do much because they didn't want to, and I just enjoyed a relaxing vacation. But I know I've been to 22 countries. You've been to probably what almost 10 times that amount, whatever the number has been. Danger. What do you perceive as danger when you travel? What's been like the most dangerous thing you've been in, and what do you say to people that think traveling to some of these countries is dangerous?
Okay, and I'm not exaggerating or lying when I say this. The most danger I felt in the last 15 years since I've started traveling was in Minneapolis.
Last year.
During the riots. Yes,
Mhm.
flat out. And I have been in East Timor the day that there was an assassination attempt on the president and the prime minister. I was in Bangkok in 2010 during the red shirt riots. I was between hundreds of cops in riot gear and thousands of protesters. I was just a white guy with a camera. And by far, Minneapolis was the and I never ever thought that would happen there. And so for when Americans are afraid, it's a fear of the unknown more than anything else. The Bahamas, if you look at ranks of like North American countries by income, the Bahamas is actually pretty well off. I
Mhm.
think the median household income in the Bahamas is well over $30,000. So as countries go, and even their crime rate, I'm sure there may be areas in parts of Nassau that have some crime, but most of the other islands don't have a very big population. I would not even think about crime in the Bahamas if I was to visit again. Um, wouldn't even be something I would worry about. Um, you just have to have a good common sense when you travel. Most crime that may affect you is crime that would be targeting you because you're a tourist, because you're an outsider. And in a lot of places, obviously, you're going to be evident as such, depending on where you visit. And even then, when you visit a country that on paper is dangerous, take, for example, Honduras. On paper, I think Honduras has the highest or one of the highest murder rates in the world. But when you look at the data, almost all of that is in the capital of Tegucigalpa, and almost all of the murder there are in a few neighborhoods, and they deal with the drug trade. If you take that away, then suddenly the homicide rate in Honduras changes dramatically. So it isn't like it's just tons of random people walking up and just knifing people. It's very specific things happening in a very specific place. The same is true in Mexico. That there are places in Mexico that uh, have a crime rate equivalent to Finland, but people paint everything with a very broad brush. So when something is happening in the north of Mexico, then some quiet little place in the Yucatan, oh, it's all Mexico because they don't understand it. Whereas in the United States, the more familiar you are, the more willing you're actually to put up with crime. So if someone from uh, a suburb of Minnesota, let's say, like
Hmm.
Edina, and they hear that some murder happens in Minneapolis, they're going to know the area well enough. They'll say, "Oh, well, that happened over there. It's
Hmm.
not happening here." Whereas an outsider might say, "Oh, well, I heard there was a murder in Minnesota. Are you all right?" Not knowing that there's a distinction between a rich suburb and what happens in a central part of the city. They understand that because they live there, but the same doesn't hold true for what they know of other countries. And that's the main reason why we have that fear.
One of the interesting things I experienced when I was in Cabo San Lucas a few months ago, I was there and I was speaking to some locals, and they assured me no one is going to harm me as the American tourist. They do. No one wants that bad that in the news. If anyone's going to get hurt there, it's going to be a Mexican. There's no chance they're putting bad
They're
publicity on.
absolutely, they are correct. Cabo San Lucas is, for all practical purposes, America. I mean, English is widely spoken. They got Walmart. They got everything. The economy of Cabo San Lucas is dependent upon tourists, and in particular, American tourists. So they're absolutely right. Uh, in fact, many of the drug lords and the gangs go out of their way to make sure that Americans never get hurt and that crime never crosses the border. So even though a place like Juarez may have a very high crime rate, just over the border, you may have very low crime rates because they know that if this ever crosses the border, that would be the excuse for the American government to come in and intervene with the American military with the backing of the Mexican government, and that is the last thing they want.
It makes a lot of sense when you've been there and experienced these things, and I just encourage anyone that hasn't done some traveling to begin. A couple other topics on traveling. I was reading through your blog and your bio, and you pointed out this question that I get. I'm someone among the people that I know. I travel more than them typically, and people always wonder what was my favorite place. And I always say I say Australia, but the only reason is I've spent more time in Australia than anywhere else. So I got to experience such a wide variety of things. And I can't come up with a better answer than that because I like going everywhere. Every experience has been different and enjoyable in its own ways. And I was reading that is that your least favorite question to be asked? What is your favorite place to be, or where's your favorite place you've been?
I understand why people ask it. It's just a question that, in a lot of sense, doesn't make sense because your experience in a place is going to be dependent upon what you do, who you're with, the weather, the time of year, and a host of other things that may just be random happenstance. It's entirely possible that you could get into a car accident, just an accident. And I've heard people say, "Oh, I had a bad time in this country. I'm never going back. No one should ever go there." And I had a great time there. I don't know what their problem was. It was just something that happened to them, and that's not something that can be a universal experience. So when people ask me what the, and to use your case of Australia, Australia is really big. Like, I
Mhm.
don't think people realize how big it is. And when you say your favorite country is, let's say we weren't American, and we said, oh, my favorite country is the United States. What does that mean? Were you in LA? That's very different than Omaha, which is very different than Dallas, which is
Mhm.
very different than Miami, which is very different than New York. It's a very big country, and the same is true with Australia. Most people, I'm guessing, you were probably on the East Coast somewhere between Melbourne City, Brisbane.
I went to Melbourne, Hobart, Sydney, Brisbane, and a tour north from there to the Great Barrier Reef. So I saw a few different things.
Yeah, that's 90% of everyone that visits Australia is going to
Mhm.
be in that area, because that, and to be fair, that's where most of the people in Australia live. But there's a whole lot. I actually drove from Darwin to Perth, which was like a 2-week drive. And that's like going from Minneapolis to San Diego via Seattle with imagine you just wiped everything off the map because there's just nothing there. Um, the answer I always give to the question is South Georgia Island, because no one has really heard of South Georgia Island. I can be pretty sure no one's ever been there. And if they have been there, they would agree with me. South Georgia Island is a place you cannot fly to. You have to go there by boat. It's between South America and Africa, north of Antarctica. Technically a British territory, but has no permanent population. And it's one of the biggest penguin breeding grounds in the world. And just going there the first time you get off the boat and you're on this rocky plain with 250,000 penguins, and it's just an incredible experience. It's smelly and it's loud, and the penguins have no fear of you, and they'll just walk right up and check you out. And there's really nothing else quite like it. I've never been in a place where there are just that many animals around you, and it's very difficult to find another place on Earth where that's even possible.
I know you've done some Everything Everywhere podcasts about some islands. Is that one that I might have heard in the last couple months, or maybe is it not done yet?
I did one on South Georgia talking about their rat eradication program. I forget when I did it. But basically, when the early Norwegian whalers set up shop on South Georgia, they brought with them rats.
Eeh.
And that has just destroyed the seabird population on the island because they would eat eggs. So they set about destroying the rats on the island, and it appears that it's been successful. And the seabird population has bounced back, more than doubled for some species. Several rare species that are endemic only to South Georgia have returned. And I would love to go back and see it since then. But that's really the only one. I may do another one on Ernest Shackleton in the future, and that's where he rescued his men. He basically took a lifeboat, made it to South Georgia, walked across the island, found a whaling ship, rescued his men, and that's a fascinating story too. That kind of has a South Georgia link.
Sounds like you got plenty of material for that in the future. I wonder, Gary, how much traveling will be in your future? Obviously, there's been a lot in your past as you look with the podcast and that you're traveling past. And when the pandemic finally is clear, you don't have to worry about taking tests everywhere and dealing with all that. What's your travel future going to look like?
Um, I don't know. I'm still going to travel, obviously, but right now my focus is on the podcast. So I'm kind of rebuilding a business that is not as dependent upon the travel industry. Even as people are starting to travel, the travel industry is still several years away from getting back to where it was, because many tourism boards are reliant on hotel taxes and things like that. So it's going to take a while. And even then, I was never really comfortable with the business I had uh, doing that. And I'm far more comfortable with podcasting as a business because it's such a clean, simple business model. I make a show, you listen to the show, I run an ad. I do some other ancillary things. I'm running a tour next year to Rome, like a deep dive tour where we're just going to do 10 days in one city.
Hmm.
And some other things. I may do some merchandise and sell some books as well. But it's a very simple, straightforward uh, business model compared to what I was doing in the past. So I want to keep growing the show. So I'm probably not going to be traveling too much until I can get to some threshold um, where the show is bringing in more money. And then I want to start hiring maybe some writers for the show. Because right now I literally do everything myself. So to take some of that burn in off of me, and that may allow me to go somewhere. And I'll probably, if I do travel, I'll probably spend more time in one place than what I did in the past, where I may have bounced around. So maybe I would get an apartment or whatever for 3 to 6 months and just stay in that one spot and work.
A term I like to use when I think about the people that have risen to a level of celebrity or fame because they've gotten so good at something is my impression is most of these people are obsessed with whatever it is that they got so good at. And that's why we know about them. So I wonder with you, is the podcast right now or something in your past, have you been obsessed about it? Were you driven in some kind of way where you feel that? Or is there some other motivation that keeps you putting in the time and the effort it takes to do it so well?
Well, the nice thing is with the podcast that I'm doing now, this is kind of what I did beforehand, anyhow. I'm the kind of guy, when I was a kid growing up, I was the kid that would read the encyclopedia. And this is before the internet, right? So now I can get lost reading Wikipedia articles and going from, one thing to an next. And I have hundreds of articles every day in my RSS reader that I will go through, which gives me a lot of show ideas. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing for the show, it's a way for me to kind of find a purpose and focus for the sort of stuff I was doing anyhow. So that's good. And yeah, I think that travel can become an obsession. And once you start doing it, before I started traveling, I had a very nice house, a 3,000 square foot house on a lake. I sold it, and then I spent the next decade basically living in out of a bag, out of crappy little rooms in hostels and other small guest houses around the world. And it kind of changed my attitude towards life and what you need. I don't think I'll ever go back to having a big home or anything like that. I don't need that much. I don't particularly want that much. I see the benefits of having a little smaller amount of things and living off that. So yeah, I'll definitely be traveling. I just don't know when I'm going to start again.
My impression is most of your traveling has been solo traveling. Is it
Yep.
by design? Other people can't get that much time away. What's the arrangement for that?
It was either travel by myself or don't travel at all.
Okay.
So I wasn't married, didn't have kids or anything when I started, and yeah, and to be honest, it is easier. I've done some stretches where I've traveled with another person, and then it's always, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? That sort of stuff. And it's easier if you can just go and do it by yourself. But that being said, I know lots of couples that travel. I know families that travel extensively and they live on the road. So it certainly can be done, whatever your situation is.
I think some of my best friends in life, the ones that are my best travel partners, become my best friends because you're really put to the test when you are traveling with somebody. And if you don't quite see eye to eye in some things, I think it becomes hard to maintain the same level of friendship coming out as going in. But if you do see eye to eye and can enjoy some of these things together, then I think can really build some great friendships. Or it's just people you meet along the way that you experience something really cool with that maybe aren't a regular day-to-day friend, but you remember them and maybe keep in touch with them more often than others.
Well, thanks to things like Facebook, I have lots of Facebook friends that I've met maybe once in
Hmm.
some other country, or I met them on a tour that I did. And they still kind of follow along with what I'm doing to this day. So yeah, that's absolutely the case.
One of the best things, and you mentioned the different circumstances of traveling in a place and what makes it be such a great experience. When I was in Australia, I had connections from previous parts of my life that I reached out to while in Australia, and they showed me things and were a part of things there that really made that trip better. Where if those couple days or few hours spent with those people didn't exist, I don't know that I'd look back on the whole trip as fondly because those were some of the best parts.
Yeah, meeting people who are local always helps. I think one of the things that a lot of travel writers say is, "Oh, you should travel like a local," and I've never really believed that because, what do you do in your day to day life? You go to work, you eat, you shop, that's what people all over the world do. They're not, it's kind of a cliche that most people who are born and raised in New York have never been to the Statue of Liberty because they don't have the same attitude as a tourist.
Hmm.
Um, if someone goes to Minneapolis, a lot of people may go to, say, the Sculpture Garden,
Yeah.
and they'll go see the spoon with the cherry on it. How many times have you been there in the last few months? I'm guessing
Only to show
zero.
people, to
Yeah, or
show
to
people
show.
you've never been here.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. So the way we go about our lives when we're at home are very different than when we're traveling, and it's always good to have those people because they can at least help you figure things out locally when you're there, and they may know of things that other people don't. But you're always going to have a different experience when you're traveling than if you just live in a place.
Just a few minutes left with you, Gary, before I let you go here. When I think back to my travel experiences, the things that I think are most memorable or most like cool, like really experienced that. I think of going to the actual Oktoberfest in Munich, scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef, and running with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain. Those are my three top highlights. What are a couple of yours that you think stand out above the rest?
I'll go with landing on, staying overnight, and being launched from a nuclear aircraft carrier. Um, I was swimming in a cage with great white sharks in South Africa,
Wow.
swimming with jellyfish in Palau, dog sledding up in the Yukon. Um, being in Thailand when they had the protests, I have to admit it was kind of exciting. Being there during that time, you kind of never knew what was going to happen. Um, then bungee jumping in New Zealand, something I did, not sure I necessarily want to do. I've done it twice. Uh, I won't say it's something that I go out of my way to do again, but I've done it. Um, and there's a lot of things which may not even sound that adventurous, but just at the time, I remember my first time in Hong Kong, sitting on the Kowloon side of the harbor, and I sat there for like 2 hours and I just watched sunset. And it's not like watching a regular sunset where you see the orb of the sun go below the horizon. It just gets darker and all the lights of Hong Kong turn on around the harbor. And I just thought that was a great experience, but it isn't necessarily the kind of thing that, you know, people are going to write poems about. Uh, there's so many things, and they sometimes are just very little that you'll experience in a lot of different places. That I have a list on my website. I have an about me page. I list some of the things I've done. It's
And
a
there were
much
so
longer,
many.
yeah.
There's so many. I don't know how to even pick a couple of the
Uh,
coolest ones. They're all so cool.
yeah, I mean, just in going to photograph polar bears up in Manitoba was fantastic. Um, yeah, it's just a lot of things.
Something that I see you have accomplished that I have not been to every state in the United States yet. I'm very close, but you said you've been to each state twice and to
Yes.
all the Canadian provinces 3 times. One thing I used to not do really is return to places once I've been there. I'd keep going to new ones, but now as I've gone to more places, sometimes I end up going back. As you go back to these places, do you totally approach it differently, or what's your motivation to go back?
There's different things. Well, I mean, a lot of cases, it's like for business or whatever, you fly to Boston again. Last time I was in Boston, just before the pandemic, I rented a car, and I'll often do this if I'm in a place for a conference. I'll spend a week after the conference, rent a car, and just drive around and do stuff. So I drove around New England. I went to some national park service sites in New Hampshire, Vermont, and around Massachusetts that I had never been to before, and kind of visited parts of the state. I went to Cape Cod. I hadn't been there before. Even a U.S. state, even smaller states tend to be pretty big, and there's parts of it you probably haven't been to. Someone could fly to Minneapolis and say, "Oh, I've been to Minnesota." Technically true, but you haven't been to the North Shore. That's a very different experience than going up to like, the Voyagers National Park or up in the North Woods, which is very different than being in the far South where it's all prairie. Minnesota is really several different states with several different regions. And most states are like that. Colorado is really three different states. There's the high prairie, which most people never visit. That's the part that's east of Denver. Denver is just right up against the mountains. Then there's the Rocky Mountains, And then there's the Colorado Plateau, which is the westernmost part. And the Rocky Mountains is, gets a lot of attention. It's where the ski resorts and everything are. But even the Colorado Plateau section doesn't necessarily get a lot of visitors either. But they're three different, very, very different parts of the state. And there's a lot of states and a lot of countries that are like that. And just because you step foot within the boundaries of a political territory doesn't mean that you've really explored it. I'm in Wisconsin right now, and I was born here, and I've lived half my life in Minnesota. There's still a lot of the state. I've never saw the biggest ball of twine in Minnesota, which is probably like, I don't know, maybe an hour, 2 hour and a half drive out of the Twin Cities. But Weird Al Yankovic wrote a song about it, and I had a friend of mine. Oh, the one place I did go in Minnesota once is, when you look at the map of Minnesota and there's the northwest angle, the part that just sticks right up at the top where it's flat. You have to drive into Canada to actually visit it. I did that once just for the heck of it. This is like 20 years ago. I just told my friends, like, want to drive up there? And they're like, sure. And we did it in like February, and we just drove up, and just for the heck of it, to say that we went there. And I guess most people from Minnesota have never been there.
I have not been there. That is the northernmost point in the lower
Continental
48
US.
states.
Yeah. And it's bizarre because there's no formal border crossing when you go in. It's just a video telephone, and it's mostly a resort in the summer. There's a handful of people that'll live there through the winter. And yeah, you can't get there by land. You have to go into Canada. You could do it by boat, but hardly anyone does it.
There's a lot of northern Minnesota that I have not yet explored, and I realize I do need to spend a little more time in my state and then not always going all over the place. One final segment I like to do, Gary, if you have a couple minutes, I do a being wrong segment where I like to ask my guest if you can look back on a former version of yourself, something that this former version of yourself did that the current version of yourself will say that was wrong. That's a wrong outlook on life, around a wrong approach to something. There's some big shift in mindset that you've had since some time ago that you now say, yeah, that old person, that old Gary he was wrong about this, but the current Gary gets it right.
I would go back and tell myself to buy Bitcoin. 2010. That would be the biggest thing. I don't know. I've never had a lot of big regrets in my life. There are some investments I've made that were horrible. I certainly regret doing that. Girlfriends, but not like, and I absolutely don't regret traveling. Not at all. It's very hard to regret traveling. And I spent, basically a decade and a half doing that. And I remember after I stopped traveling full time, I got an apartment again. I unpacked the things that I originally put in storage, and it was weird because I had like basically hit pause on my life for a decade. And I was taking stuff out of these boxes that hadn't been touched or seen sunlight in all that time. And they were just like they were. But of course, everything else went on. And all my friends that from before I started traveling, they got married or had kids, and were doing other things in their life. But yeah, I don't really regret a whole lot about it. There isn't anything I look back on and say I wouldn't do again, or that I was necessarily wrong about. I think there are always things like, certain factual things you kind of always have to update your um, mental database about, and that changes over time. But I think everyone kind of sort of does that.
Yeah, when I think about travel, I grew up on a farm. We had chores to do morning and night. We barely ever left like the chores to somebody else. So that's why we took one vacation in my childhood. It was a 3-day trip to the Wisconsin Dells. It did not go that well. We never did another trip. And I left my childhood and teenage years thinking, I don't travel. I don't want to travel. I wouldn't want to go to some other country. I like all the things I got going on here. So to me, when it comes to travel, I was wrong. That young, naive version of me was wrong about how much I love traveling and how important it is to me. So I do think there are people, and maybe not everyone would love travel. There are people that say, I don't want to travel, not interested in travel, that just haven't gotten over that hump that I got over. And maybe you did at some point too, to realize, wow, there's something to this that I just love.
Yeah, I kind of so when I sold my company back in the 90s, the company I sold it to was this big international company, and I sort of conned them into sending me to all their offices around the world to talk about the internet. So they sent me on a whirlwind 3-week trip where I went to Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Frankfurt, Paris, Brussels, and London. I'd never, really outside of crossing the border quickly in Canada and Mexico. That's the only international experience I've ever had, and that was very eye opening. But I never before that felt like travel was something that I didn't do. Our family didn't do a ton of it. We did, some camping trips growing up, but that was about it. And that was kind of really eye opening. And I do think that I have met people that said, "Oh, that's just not what we do." I wanted to study abroad for a semester when I went to college, and uh, my parents just sort of poo-pooed that idea because it was just not something that they could conceive of. I was the first person to even go to college. Going to college for a semester in another country was just not something that they could, deal with. And I had a really good friend. She was very smart. She never went to college, and I said, "Well, you could go to college. You could be a lawyer. Just go it, do it, apply to law school." And she couldn't. She just couldn't wrap her head around that. It's like, I can't do that. I'm not one of those people that can do that. And the reality is, 80% of the game is just accepting the fact that this is something that you can do, and there's nothing stopping you from doing it. And for travel, it's really easy. You just go buy a ticket. For most people, if you have a passport and at least a credit card and a sufficient amount of money, it doesn't have to be a lot. You can be in another country within 48 hours of hearing my voice saying that, if you
Mhm.
really wanted to. You could be on the other side of the world. Granted, you would work schedules and family issues and stuff. I'm putting that aside, but it could be done, and you just have to want to do it, and that's the biggest thing.
And once you do it, once you get a taste of it, then you can design your life to allow for more of it, which is clearly what you have done and did for a long stretch of time. It's something I've been doing in recent years, and I think for anyone, you can find a way. If you really like it, you'll find a way to do more of it.
I know many people who travel extensively, and they've been to, over 100 countries, and they have regular full-time jobs. And the way they do it is they work so they can travel, and that's where their money goes. That's where their time off goes. They get, ample vacation time, and they use it. And that's what they use it for, rather than buying a cabin up north and a jet ski and all this other stuff. They use it to travel. So yeah. And I think also people living or traveling full time is a lot cheaper than people realize that it is. You can travel full time and live way cheaper than most people are living in the United States. Because when you factor in your rent slash mortgage, utilities, insurance, and food and everything else that you spend in a month, and you were to go, say, just live in Bangkok or something, you're going to spend a fraction of that. You can get a very nice furnished apartment in Bangkok for like $500 a month. And you can get something that's very tolerable for even less than that, which is a fraction of what you're going to be paying in a large urban area in the United States. And then toss on top of that food and everything else. And there are cases like that all over the world, whether you're going to Central America, Southeast Asia, uh, Eastern Europe, that are very, very cheap to visit.
It's great advice. 2 episodes ago, I had a guest named Julie Rose who's doing her version of this in the United States this year, but is planning to do more international soon, where she got rid of her house and has been a nomad for over a year. And you did your version of it now, and maybe it's a little bit different with COVID. But as we come out of this, eventually, I think more and more people working from home will just not really have much of a home, and will be going as much as possible.
There's been a huge, the change with COVID hasn't been an issue of technology. It's been an issue of culture. What we're doing right now is you're in one place, I'm in another, and we're talking to each other and we can see each other. This has been around for quite a while. We've been able to do Skype conferencing for well over a decade. But culturally, the idea of not coming into an office or doing a virtual meeting instead of flying somewhere hasn't really been acceptable. And now I think that's changed. And there are more and more companies that are letting people work from wherever they want. I met one guy several years ago, worked for a Silicon Valley company. He was a programmer, and they said, "Oh yeah, well for us, you can work from wherever you want." And he said, "Okay, I picked Thailand." And they thought he was going to pick Fresno or San Jose or something, not Thailand. And they're like, they honored it. They said, "Well, okay." Turned out it worked great because he was able to code when everyone was asleep. And so much of the team would go to bed, they with whatever they've done. He would
Mhm.
then work on it while they were sleeping, and then there would be fixes and updates ready for them when they got to work the next day. And it allowed for a quasi type of 24-hour development cycle. And I think there are more and more companies that are actually discovering that there are benefits to having people work remotely from different places. So I think we're going to see a lot more of it in the future.
And based on the schedule, you said that you do late into the night, and I kind of prefer working on my projects late into the night. Life is less distracting when most people are sleeping, and I
Yeah.
think you can get a lot more done.
Or I was just thinking, I could move to Hawaii and I'd have a normal schedule. I just keep my same schedule. I wouldn't be jet lagged at all.
Northern Wisconsin or Hawaii, those are two very tough choices, Gary. I hope you make the right choice.
It's not easy, but I'm sure it will.
Thanks a lot for your time today, Gary. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.